I am very grateful to have this opportunity to share with our educators some research we've been doing at Illuminate Education to examine the COVID slide. These certainly are uncertain times. As we enter the summer break, there is still a great deal of uncertainty as to what instruction will look like in the fall. Will it be exclusively online? Will students be required to keep social distancing guidelines? Will face masks be required? Will caregivers be reluctant to send children to school? Even in the best case scenario, most schools will be entering the fall session with far less knowledge of the instructional needs of their students than in prior years. This is further compounded by the fact that, from all accounts, the transition to remote instruction this spring has been uneven. Uneven across districts and uneven across households within districts. Perhaps now more than ever, schools need data to guide decision making. To that end, I'm going to share results from research we did using FastBridge data. The purpose of this research is to approximate the effects of the interruption to instruction and the move to distance-based learning on student performance using FastBridge reading and math assessments. My colleague and I analyzed FastBridge data from a cohort of students who completed A reading and A math across 4 screening periods from the fall of 2018 through the fall of 2019. The sample consisted of about 500,000 students for each assessment. We chose these 2 assessments because they provide broad coverage of state learning standards and because they report results on a vertical scale that spans kindergarten through grade 12. There are 2 important benefits of using cohort data. 1, it enables us to measure growth directly at the student level. 2, we can use each student's prior growth rate to more accurately predict future performance. The first step in our analysis was to compute the difference between fall 2019 and spring 2019 scores on A math and A reading. That simple difference tells us how learning is impacted over the summer break. It also corresponds closely to what we see in the national norms. However, it may not accurately represent the true impact of being out of school. This is because instruction typically continues after spring screening and starts up again before fall screening. So for the next step, we computed the amount of classroom instruction for each student between screening periods. Then we used each student's prior winter to spring growth score to approximate how much learning would have occurred. That additional learning was subtracted from the fall score to estimate the actual effect of the absence of formal instruction. The results are summarized on the right-hand section of this slide. For A reading in kindergarten and grade 1, we see very little decline, a bit less than 1 month decline in performance over the summer after adjusting for additional classroom learning between screenings. For other grades, performance remains flat. With A math, we see bigger declines. These range from about a 2-month decline in early elementary grades to a bit less than 1 month decline in middle school. Next, we extrapolated the results back to March to approximate what the effects of student performance from a larger break would be. Here is a figure depicting the results for A math. The black solid curve shows the median performance for the grade 1 cohort across seasons, from the fall of 2018 to the fall of 2019. The solid line is labeled typical because this is the result we get in the national population without any adjustments for additional learning between spring and fall screening. This also represents a best case scenario. The purple line extending down to mid-March indicates the approximate date at which in-classroom instruction was disrupted due to the COVID pandemic. The dashed line labeled summer slide extension is our best estimate of the worst case scenario. That is, this line assumes students obtain no benefit from distance-based instruction. Compared to the national average, scores for that group would drop about 5 points. The flat growth line, as the name implies, represents no change in performance from mid-March. This may serve as a better estimate of how performance will be affected in schools where distance learning was fairly successful. Now let's look at A reading results. There are 2 distinct differences between reading and math. First, you'll note that there are only 2 lines, flat and typical. Second, the typical growth line shows an uptick from spring to fall. The summer slide line is not present because the summer effect was flat. That is, there was almost no summer learning loss on A reading in grade 1. The typical growth line shows an uptick from spring to fall because in the population, reading scores actually go up a bit from spring to fall. This is consistent with other published studies that I'll discuss next. First, let's look at how results in the fall of 2020 are likely to compare to the fall of 2019. For both A reading and A math, the COVID slide tends to be greatest in early elementary grades. In reading, we expect about a 6-point loss in primary grades to about a 2-point loss in middle school. This assumes relatively flat growth from March, and these represent modest effects, about 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviation units. In math, we expect performance to drop from 5 points in early elementary to about 1 point in middle school. This is consistent with extrapolating the summer learning loss back to March. These represent small to moderate effects from about 0.1 to 0.5 standard deviation units. In CBM reading, the FastBridge oral reading fluency assessment, we expect performance to drop about 11 words correct per minute in grade 2 to about 5 words correct per minute in grade 6. These represent modest effects from about 0.1 to about 0.25 standard deviation units. Now I want to turn to what published research tells us about the summer slide and the effectiveness of summer programs towards improving learning outcomes. Summer reading program research provides additional insight into how reading performance changes across the summer for students from varying income groups, as well as how the summer slide, or COVID slide in this case, can be neutralized. Here's a summary of findings from a meta-analysis published in 2014. Meta-analytic studies combine results across many studies. In doing so, they provide more robust results of the true program effects. This meta-analysis included studies that used a control group. Control groups are students who did not participate in the summer reading program under study. Thus, the control group represents what we would expect from typical summer losses. As with the FastBridge summer slide results, they found that general reading scores remained flat across the summer. However, when broken down by household income as estimated by free or reduced lunch status, students in low-income households experienced about a 1-month learning decline, whereas students in middle and high-income households actually experienced about a 1-month learning gain. Among the students participating in research-based summer reading programs, there was a significant overall improvement in performance. Gains were higher for students from economically disadvantaged areas, thus reducing the achievement gap relative to students from higher income households. The biggest gains were found in decoding skills among students in early elementary grades. And this is consistent with other research that shows decoding skills develop rapidly with appropriate direct instruction. Additionally, and this is very interesting, they found that the quantity and quality of child-initiated reading also improved performance. That is, students who selected books in the spring and read at least 6 books over the summer performed significantly better in the fall. The bottom line is this: we can expect some performance declines in reading and math relative to prior years and a widening of the achievement gap unless instructional mitigation is undertaken. My colleague, Dr. Sarah Brown, will be addressing things schools can do in the fall to reduce these effects. Next up, Dr. Rachel Brown will review important steps to take to obtain the most accurate screening results in the fall.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting and important information. Now that you have learned some more about the types of decline or growth that students make, we're going to talk a bit about various FastBridge assessments that can be used for screening. I'm going to talk about the importance of screening and all of your students coming this fall, regardless of where and how instruction is provided. I'll also address why screening is more important this fall than in perhaps other falls where you've been a teacher, and I want to talk about how you go about selecting your assessments as well as some logistics. So why do we recommend that everybody do universal screening? Well, universal screening in schools is just like taking your child to the doctor for regular well-child visits. Physicians know the typical growth that infants and children make as they grow. Well-child visits give parents and their care providers data and opportunity to address any differences observed between a child's actual and expected height, weight, and other wellness variables. In the same way, teachers can use school-based screening data to compare a child's academic and behavior data with school-based expectations for learning. Such screening is even more important now because learning has been disrupted for most all of the students in the United States due to COVID-19. In addition, the combination of flat growth or decline from the spring of 2020 disruption with that typical summer loss that John was talking about means that the best starting place for fall instruction might not be where you have started instruction in the past. Universal screening data will help teachers know what instruction students need as the school year begins. These starting places might or might not be different from the past, so such data are essential this year more than before. So these are the FastBridge screening assessments that are possible to be used for this type of universal screening that we're talking about. And so I invite those of you who are already FastBridge users to think about which of these you've used in the past, because that's going to be important as you think about what screening assessments to use moving into this coming fall. So FastBridge recommends some very specific combinations of assessments to be used for universal screening in reading, math, and behavior. We know that you may not do your screening in all three areas, but we do have recommendations in all these areas. Now, the screeners that you see on your screen right now are the ones that not only we recommend, but for reading and math, also are part of what we call Fast Track. We have Fast Track in reading and in math. And so if you are already using or planning to use Fast Track, then you would be using our recommended assessments. However, there are some additional considerations. So it's important as you think about how to best do universal screening this coming fall, what screening assessments you've used in the past. This is because of the importance of consistency. In order to calculate your students' growth rates related to COVID-19, you will need to use those same assessments from the 2019-2020 school year in the fall of 2020. And in addition, it's possible that if you were to change the screeners this year, it might create additional stress for students and teachers. Another variable that's very important as you think about what we will be considering for screening this coming year has to do with the locations where instruction will happen. So as we've experienced this spring, the location of learning doesn't necessarily have to be on a school campus. And in the fall, your students might be in various locations. Some schools might have detailed plans for this fall, but others might still be working to develop them. And so even if your school plans to resume on-campus instruction, there could be students who cannot come to campus due to pre-existing health conditions or whose parents are not yet willing to send them. Schools should plan for both instruction and assessment that will happen in the school setting as well as at home. So making sure you're planning for both on-campus traditional screening in school and screening that can happen for students who continue to participate in learning in a home environment. And this will affect the format, timing, and logistics of your fall screening. So the next slide provides information about the formats of all of the FastBridge screening assessments. And as you can see, we have both computer-based and teacher-based. This is the primary distinction that will be important as you think about how and when all screening should be conducted. Again, as much as possible, we recommend you use whatever screener you've used in the past to maintain consistency, but you'll also have to think about screening format in order to make sure all students can participate. Please be aware we have many documents with detailed guidance about conducting distance-based screening in the FastBridge knowledge base. So if you've decided to screen with the computer-based assessments, the benefit is that students can take this assessment on a device, whether they're at school or in the home, and you'll have immediate access to the results. If you do continue with those computer-based assessments, just be sure that you consider all three of the steps that you see on this slide. You need to remember to make the tests available so that the students will be able to see them. You need to make sure that all teachers who are participating in conducting the screening have training to do that so that the results will be reliable and valid. And you'll also want to make sure that you provide instructions for the students and their family members who might be assisting them. It's possible you'll also use teacher-administered assessments. While we recommend you use our computer-based assessments for virtual or at-home screening because they will probably be the easiest, we know that it can be very beneficial to have the data from the teacher-based assessments. And if that's what you've used in the past, those data will be very important. So I'm going to provide some reminders about our teacher-based assessments. There are three main things that are very important to remember if you're going to do teacher-conducted assessments while students are in the home learning environment. And these are test security, some scheduling considerations, and how to administer the assessments while the students are learning from home. First, just a reminder about test security. When assessments are administered in schools, it's easy to keep track of them. And we recommend that you have a binder of the FastBridge student materials in the teacher's lounge, and then anybody who needs them can have access, but they don't leave the building, and so they remain secure. When they are administered at home and when parents are helping, there is a threat that test security will be violated because parents may see the content and or there could be a thought maybe to print some of the materials. We recommend that your assessment of these particular screeners be done so that neither the student nor the parent would need to print anything and all of the test content remains secure. Because test security remains important regardless of where the student is completing the assessment. Another factor for at-home administration will be scheduling. Because the teacher-conducted assessments are all one-on-one, it will be necessary to have scheduled times when the teacher and student can meet in an online environment and complete the assessment. We're certainly all learning more about how we deliver remote learning and assessment. And if you have a SWAT team administering all of the screening assessments for your school, that could have an influence on how you communicate with family members. we recommend that you have the classroom teacher be the primary point of contact around all of these scheduling logistics with families so that there's consistency in communication and parents don't get overwhelmed by multiple people contacting them from the school. Finally, there's some additional planning and logistics you'll want to consider for those teacher-based assessments. Certainly think about student access and whether or not the student has all the hardware, software, and internet access necessary. Certainly teacher readiness to conduct the assessments in this manner will be very important. The teacher has been doing these assessments this spring already. That should be fairly easy, and a quick refresher could be done. However, if it's a new teacher or someone who hasn't done distance-based assessment in the past, some preparation and training will be all the more important for standardized administration and scoring. We have a tremendous amount of information in the FastBridge knowledge base with detailed guidance for teachers, as well as forms that can be sent home to families to support the distance-based screening assessments. And we encourage you to look at those resources as you prepare and plan for fall assessments. So we know that this fall screening will be somewhat the same and somewhat different. The back to school experience will definitely be different from any we've known. That said, there will be some features of fall screening that will be the same as they've always been, and others that are different. As in the past, all students will be invited and included in screening, and standardized procedures need to be used. And the results will help teachers plan instruction. At the same time, participation rates might be lower due to attendance changes. Local norms might not be available because of how many students can participate, and the scores could be lower due to interruptions caused by COVID-19. Despite these different features, universal screening remains an essential component of how teachers can learn and respond to their students' academic and behavior instruction needs. And we very much continue to recommend universal screening for your students so that you will be able to identify where they're at with learning and provide timely and effective instruction for all students. I'm going to turn over the microphone now to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Brown, who's going to share with us some information on universal instruction that might follow from universal screening.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's spend some time exploring the importance of strong universal instruction this fall. We'll talk a bit about the role of the universal tier as we prepare for this fall, and then explore the actions that your team can take to support the intensification of the universal tier. So for schools implementing an MTSS, this pyramid likely looks really familiar to you. For those of you less familiar with an MTSS model, this pyramid represents all of the resources we have in schools. So that includes the curriculum, the instructional strategies, our staff, and of course, one of the most valuable things we have, time, right? Districts implementing an MTSS focus on using their resources strategically to meet all students' needs. So today we're going to focus on the Tier 1 or universal instructional resources that schools use. We're focusing here because these represent the most resources in any given school. It represents the most time we have, the most staff we have, and the most materials and parts of our schedules that we can use. Universal instruction represents the curriculum, instruction, and assessment that all of our students receive. It's intended to support the needs of the vast majority of students in your school. So if your universal instruction isn't strong enough, you'll find that you have more students who need intervention than you have intervention resources to support. Even so, the universal tier is sometimes the forgotten tier in an MTSS. We can get so caught up in identifying students for Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions and all the work that goes into scheduling those, delivering those, did I say scheduling those, that we forget to focus time in our data team meetings and in our MTSS work addressing Tier 1 or universal tier needs. Obviously, this fall, Tier 1 will be of utmost importance as many schools are expecting increased numbers of students' needs, and John has talked a little bit about that as we were first getting started. One way to support all students who have additional academic and social emotional behavioral needs is through focusing resources in our district and school to provide additional support in the universal tier. This assures that all students are provided with intensified support as we enter the 2020-2021 school year. There are many ways to intensify the universal tier to allow for supporting increased student needs. In schools, there's a lot we can control and that we can do to improve the effectiveness of the universal tier we provide when it's needed. These apply to both academic and social emotional behavioral needs. So sometimes you may increase the amount of time that is spent on specific skills. For instance, if we realize that students come back this fall having lost automaticity with their math facts, we may extend math instruction for 5 minutes a day and have students practice their facts with a peer. We can also increase the number of days a week we focus on specific skills. Instead of one lesson on social emotional behavior a week, maybe we have intentional activities focused on social emotional behavior every single day. We can also teach the same content, but shift to implementing an evidence-based routine. This shift doesn't mean you were teaching something wrong before. What it does is ensure that more students in your class can benefit from the instruction and that all students are fully participating. For instance, we may have time in middle school where students read with a goal of building their fluency. Maybe instead of a silent sustained reading strategy, we could implement an evidence-based fluency routine for 10 minutes per day. This would serve the same purpose, but would ensure that some students weren't able to avoid the reading activity. It's not always necessarily easy or feasible, but decreasing group size can also support a more intensified experience for students. This strategy is helpful when we can then take advantage of the smaller group size to increase student chances to practice and receive feedback during instruction. I've seen a decreased group size during Tier 1 by having a specialist join a specific grade level or a specific classroom during core instruction to allow for increased numbers of small groups or increased teacher involvement during individual student work time. Another common strategy is to target specific skills. So for example, we may expect that all first grade teachers address phonemic awareness every day. In the past, maybe every teacher has decided how to do this and for how long. We may decide this fall that we want all first grade teachers to spend 15 minutes per day focusing on specific phonemic awareness skills such as sound manipulation or sound deletion. And a reading coach or interventionist may help the team determine which skills to teach at which times of the year. And last but not least, I'd like to highlight the option to improve motivation. Improving student motivation supports the ability for students to get the most benefit from our high quality instruction. So this can be done in many ways, from providing meaningful and relevant work to giving choice throughout the day and building strong relationships with students. So improving student motivation can be another way we can intensify universal tier instruction. As we think about all of these things, there are ways that each of us in our roles can contribute to an intensified universal tier this fall. We'll spend the next few minutes exploring ways that leaders, teachers, and specialists can support the improvement of the universal tier. District level leaders can support resource allocation that's focused on intensifying universal instruction when needed. When you think about that pyramid, we know that the pyramid represents all of the resources in our district or school. And so that pyramid then has the resources, and a district level leader can help support the allocation of those resources toward intensifying the universal tier. Fall screening data can support those decisions. So this is an example of the group screening report for leaders in FastBridge. The top bar chart displays the overall percentage of students meeting benchmarks in reading, while below you can see each school's performance. Let's look more closely at those data. So in this case, the district leader can see that the middle school has higher percentages of students at risk of not meeting reading proficiency than the elementary or high school. In addition, it's clear that there are not enough intervention resources to meet the needs of all students who did not meet the fall benchmark, as only 56% of students in the middle school are. Given this information, the district leader may decide to use resources in a way that addresses this need via universal instruction. How that looks would absolutely be different in every school, depending on the district level resources. But in a district with instructional coaches, for instance, if they're available at the middle school level, a curriculum director may decide to focus their time on addressing this need through whole group intervention. In another district with strong PLC structures, they may decide to have teachers address these needs through increasing the time or days per week focused on specific skills. The big idea here is that the district leaders can use their fall screening data to identify specific needs and then target district level resources to intensify universal instruction toward those needs. Staying in the same report, building principals can also review the group screening report at the leader level. These data are shown at the individual grade level. So here, the principal can see that the 2nd and 5th grade level classes have the lowest percentage of students meeting benchmark. So again, how resource allocation looks will depend on your resources, but a principal could deploy an instructional coach to support a team in implementing an evidence-based strategy potentially. They may work with a grade level team to provide additional professional learning time or work to increase the instructional time and specific skills. Again, the strategy taken will differ depending on your resources and students' needs. The goal is to increase the opportunity for all students to benefit from a more intensive universal tier. That way, students who may not get much intervention or those who don't receive intervention at all can still improve their learning trajectories. Each teacher can also use their fall screening data to support universal instruction intensification. This is a picture of a section of the screening to intervention report within FastBridge. This shows the total percentage of students who meet benchmarks in specific reading skills. It then provides a recommended plan and intervention to use class-wide. In this case, this class has the lowest numbers of students meeting benchmarks in phonics and fluency. Because of these class-wide data, the report suggests that specific plan. Let's go to that plan. So the plan provides 2 recommendations. First, it indicates the suggested percentage of instructional time that should be devoted to each of the 5 big ideas of reading. In this case, 25% of time should be focused on sound or phonemic awareness, and 25% on code or phonics and fluency, and last 45% on meaning or vocabulary and comprehension skills. The instructional focus for this whole group intervention is on skills in the sound and code area. The second recommendation, lower on the screen, provides specific whole group interventions that address specific skills in phonemic awareness and phonics that are matched to this group's skills levels. These interventions are then available for teachers to access within the FastBridge system, and they can implement them in their classroom. And last but not least, we want to talk about ways that specialists can support the intensification of universal instruction. Specialists such as instructional coaches, interventionists, and others in schools provide vital support to teachers in deciding what and how they intensify universal instruction. Again, depending on your school, this may look different. But thinking about all of those ways we can intensify instruction, there are many ways specialists can help. Specialists may help teachers select evidence-based routines. For example, a literacy specialist may use the screening to intervention report to identify specific needs, then review their resources to identify a few evidence-based routines that can be used to address those needs. The literacy specialist then brings those routines to a PLC, and the team decides together to implement one of the routines. The specialist could then train the team right then and there and offer to model it in classrooms. In another school, an interventionist may support a grade level in implementing whole group intervention. They might identify the intervention with a strong instructional match through screening data, such as the screening to intervention report, then provide training to the team and again, model the intervention in classrooms. And finally, no matter which intensification strategy is shown, is chosen, a specialist can support teachers to overcome barriers to implementation. Any change in a school is tough. We have schedules, routines, and amongst those schedules and routines, sometimes it seems like chaos and interruptions. When barriers arise, which we know that they always will, we can either abandon new strategies or we can identify ways to support each other to get the intensification we know students need. Specialists can facilitate discussions with teams to provide time and the right questions to unearth and address those barriers. It's less about their expertise that helps in this moment and more about taking the time to ask what's going well and what has been challenging. Then teams can plan solutions together. Although many of our specialists spend most of their time supporting students needing intervention, within an MTSS, and this fall especially, having purposeful focus from specialists on the universal tier can make all the difference. Remember, MTSS is about how we use our resources, and I encourage you to consider the resources that can be devoted to the universal tier to support students' needs this fall. So I hope that this conversation about expectations, given data trends, screening assessments, and the considerations to make for a successful universal screening period this fall, and a focus on using your fall screening data to support intensification of your universal tier has been helpful. We've tried to save plenty of time, and it looks like we have, for questions, and we will open it up for further discussion now.
Thank you, Sarah. I actually will start with a question that came in for you during your portion of the presentation. One of our listeners mentioned how much that she liked the idea of increasing the amount of time to assist with student achievement. However, she was wondering about the students who do not attend the meetings or do the work. It was noted that these students will continue to fall behind. So how can we help these students in particular?
Yeah, so it sounds like she's talking about when we're on online instruction potentially. Is that the sense you got, Livy?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think for this, a lot of this seems to be, well, first, I don't think there's an easy answer to this, right? We've all been battling this spring. And when we think about potentially hybrid type model schools in the fall, this will continue to be something that we continue to work on. One of the things that I've learned from talking to different schools and educators is around how teachers have found really creative ways to motivate students to attend. And so some of the creative ways that I've really been impressed by include having some really fun activities that may or may not, frankly, be instructional based. Hopefully they're a little bit related to instruction, but having those, but having them that you're required to get the code to get in by turning in work or attending other sessions. I think that's really clever. I've also heard of other ideas, and I'm sure that there are people who could share some ideas here too, but those are some ideas. I think the motivation piece is really important there, and finding ways to engage students. And so if we can tailor something that we're going to talk about, a topic around something that we know a student is interested in, who has been less than engaged in our online instruction, to try to get them in. If we can make personal calls and try to continue to reach out. The big piece is not to give up on students that we've had difficulty finding, and to just continue to find ways to reach out and try to motivate those students to participate.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. John, I actually have a question for you. I have two for you. The first is, you referenced the study done by Kim and Quinn from 2014. The question is, was that study based on home interventions or community-based interventions? And the reason for the question is, knowing that libraries are not yet fully open in some parts of the country for summer reading programs, there's a concern that students might not have access to do that additional reading that you mentioned over the summer period.
Yeah, that's a great question. The meta-analysis itself, the studies that they were actually examining for the meta-analysis, were based on summer reading programs, but they were also reviewing the literature. So rather than, I didn't do my due diligence and cite who they actually cited, but there was some other research that suggests that students who self-select books at the end of the school year and read those over the summer actually did show improved reading performance across the summer break. So wasn't exactly part of the meta-analysis, but it was part of the literature review.
Great, thank you. And then the second question here, I think you did kind of get to it, but I know some people joined us a little bit late. For the information that you included based on the study, is that at all, how do you account for the fact that some students may not be doing any work during this time of being away and remote? Maybe if you could kind of just do like a really high level summary of
Sure.
that.
I'll say a couple things. Great question also. And first, the results I'm presenting are basically averages across large samples of students. So you're going to have a lot of variability with any group, and especially if you start looking at data for smaller programs, smaller schools at the grade level, you're going to see much more fluctuation in performance relative to our projections. So our projections are kind of for larger groups of students with recognition that there's a lot of variability. It's interesting that the skill of extracting meaning from text, once a student becomes fairly proficient or fluent with decoding and reading words and connected text, and they start to extract more and more meaning from text, that skill sort of crystallizes to some degree. So it's more impervious to learning loss. And that's what we see over the summer break. So all kinds of studies show that reading performance tends to stay flat or actually improves a little bit for middle and high income students. And it's possibly because reading is something you can engage in all the time, right? There's no restriction on it. Math, on the other hand, is something that would be a little bit harder to engage in at home. There are techniques that people probably could use. I've seen some research out there that suggests some fun activities kids can do over the summer, including working with ingredients, helping with shopping lists and things like that, and tallying up totals and things like that. But we do definitely see a math difference between reading and math. That is, we see a much greater decline in math. And if you think about it, the skills that students are acquiring are more procedural knowledge, which are a little bit more fluid, and that they may not have completely mastered a skill, and it's so much more easy to lose that knowledge if you haven't really mastered it and really crystallized that mastery. So something like even automaticity, as Sarah mentioned, automaticity could decline as well over the summer months. So that may be something that you need to focus on in the beginning of the fall. But I think the big message here is it's going to be variable. Even for kids, though, that probably are not participating a lot in reading instruction, that are otherwise okay readers, they're probably not going to see a major decline over the summer. But kids in math, especially kids struggling, will probably see pretty substantial declines. Just as a point of reference, we also looked at kids by risk category. And one of the things that we found was actually kind of counterintuitive. Kids in high risk category actually showed more positive changes over the summer break than kids in low risk categories. And what we realized as we look deeper is that there's somewhat of an inverse relationship between growth in the prior season and growth in the next season. So kids that had high growth from fall to winter, from winter to spring, tended to see bigger declines from spring to fall. Kids that had low growth from winter to spring tended to have flat or maybe even slight inclines from spring to fall. And kids that are in the high risk group tended to be more likely to have low growth in the spring months. And so it was sort of a regression to the mean. So they actually showed a little bit more positive effects across the summer. I think it's an artifact of regression to the mean. I don't think that they're actually learning more over the summer months, but it's something to be aware of, that you might see some kind of counterintuitive trends among the high risk versus low risk students.
Excellent. Thank you, John. We have a few more questions for you, but I think actually, Rachel, I'll go to you next here. So many great questions came in. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. There were quite a few questions, Rachel, in regards to how do we know for sure that a student is really taking the test, that it's being done with fidelity, if we are doing the remote or distance learning in this time, or potentially back, when school resumes in the fall. There seem to be a few questions around, is it possible that parents or siblings could give answers, and how do you account for that?
Excellent question, and we do get this question fairly often. And here's where thinking about the decision to use the computer-based or the teacher-administered assessments becomes really important. It is the case that if you choose to do the teacher-based assessments, the problem of parent assistance pretty much goes away, because it's a one-on-one session where the teacher will observe the student completing the task in real time. And unless the parent has gone to really extraordinary efforts to coach the child in some way, which I would think you would see on the screen or here, it's not possible that the student will, have that help in that kind of one-on-one real-time testing environment. So it's basically, it's like what you do if the kid was in school with you. If you do choose the computer-based assessment, since the teacher won't observe that being done, there is the possibility that the parent or some other person in the house could provide input or answers for the student's completion. Our guidance that we have arranged that you could send home to families goes over the reasons why we hope they won't choose to do that. Because it will invalidate the responses. The other thing that has gone through my mind very often in this time is the fact that while, of course, parents and kids or other family members are home together and could be in the fall, if that remains the case, those other family members are likely as busy as their kids with their daily work responsibilities. And I'm not really sure that they would have the time or energy to, expend on helping their student complete a school-based assessment. I think as all of this becomes more normal, if you will, I would envision that family members would be less inclined to take advantage of these opportunities, so on, quote unquote, but rather would see it as a typically occurring assessment, just as it would if the student was on campus. At the end of the day, we must have trust that family members are facilitating learning experiences and environments that are truly in their child's best interest. And I believe that we want to place that trust in family members. If, however, you see a radically different score for a student, then the teacher really needs to think about if it's a reliable and valid score, and perhaps not be able to utilize those data for instructional planning, and therefore also utilize other information. I know that was long, but hopefully it addresses the variables that are in play when we talk about students completing computer-based assessments at home.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Sarah, I'm going to go back to you if you don't mind. You had a suggestion on longer hours, and the question is, would the district's superintendents perhaps consider the quote old norm summer vacation, where students perhaps 3 days a week continue to attend online learning with their teachers?
Oh, so I'm guessing this refers to the strategy of increasing either the length of time or the number of days a week for specific instruction. So I was specifically referring to when we think about the number of days a week that we teach specific skills, or the number of days a week that we address specific student needs within an instructional day. And so, for instance, sometimes we have reading where we have small groups, maybe 3 days a week, or small groups 2 days a week, a part of our core instruction. We might want to increase those, the frequency of those for students, or increase the frequency of days that we address specific needs. I think this is going to be especially prevalent when we think about social emotional behavioral needs, that we've tended to, in many schools, count on our social workers or school psychs to have specific lessons that maybe they come in once a week or a couple times a month and give those lessons, and then we kind of go on with our typical instruction. It might be that we need to think about if we want to do these lessons daily, or we want to do something more often, then we can have a social worker in our room. Then we may need to do something where the social worker or school psychologist comes to our PLC and we develop together how we can address those needs on a daily basis within our school. So I was speaking more to within the confines of your already set schedule, Although I have heard conversations in different schools in different states about potentially starting school earlier in the fall or having extended summer school programs, and I appreciate also the need for those things.
Thank you, Sarah. John, I'm going to go back to you for this one. In the event that school is not able to screen this fall due to maybe access to technology or lack thereof, would it be reasonable for the school to use the middle of year data from the previous school year to guide as a starting point for fall instruction?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would answer vehemently saying find a way to screen in the fall. It's going to be the most proximal, the most accurate. There's so much variation, as we talked about earlier, between last January and what will happen this fall. I would be very hesitant to make that recommendation. On the other hand, the analysis that we're using to project results suggests that if in the worst case scenario, that is, you cannot absolutely do screening, you might use that as a reasonable guide, the flat growth estimate, that things just haven't declined in reading, and that the declines that we see in math, those projections, as a starting point. So those expectations of 5 to 1 point drop in A math, and I can't remember exactly what I quoted in A reading, but I would strongly recommend trying to find a way to do screening in the fall.
John, I'm going to ask you one more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I jump in with that one a little bit, Livy?
Please do.
Yeah, I just want to add that if there are specific students, so when we think about universal screening, we're trying to assess obviously every single student to make those decisions. When you're speaking about not necessarily being able to universally screen, I'm guessing that means that there are some students for whom we don't have the access to be able to screen, but that we're still able to screen for most of the students in our school. When we have students who we're not able to get good screening data for, that lack of data is actually really good data. That tells me that this is a student that I need to be spending extra time reaching out to and go to extra lengths to to access, because it's sometimes also impossible to know whether it's because of a lack of internet access, a lack of a device, the kind of choosing not to sign on, and so we don't necessarily know why students aren't accessing our instruction. And so going through extra measures to try to engage students, find who these students are, and figure out what the barriers are to them accessing instruction, and get them into engagement with their teachers regularly is super important, and something that we probably shouldn't just say kind of check off a student as a student that we haven't been able to access, but find them as quickly as we can, get them highly engaged, and then as soon as makes sense, get some screening data for those students.
Great, thank you, Sarah. John, I'm just going to go back to you again quickly here. I know we have about 6 minutes left. We have a lot more questions to go, but I know we got this one a few times. Do you have recommendations for screeners, or have your recommendations for the screeners to use changed due to COVID-19 school closures? So for example, would it be beneficial to add our reading to grades 2 and 3 in addition to A reading and CBM reading?
I'm going to probably defer that to my colleague, Dr. Rachel Brown, but if you don't mind, I'm going to actually make mention to a question that was asked earlier about research based on home programs, home reading over the summer months. I'm just going to give you the citation, well, at least the author's name and year. It was Senecal and Young, 2008. That's SENECHAL and Young, 2008. So Rachel, if you don't mind giving your perspective on the question about would we recommend altering the assessments this fall, that'd be great.
Excellent question. Yes, I'll be happy to. Thanks, John. In general, our answer is no, because the assessments, if you look at our standing recommendations for what assessments to use for screening, they are based on research indicating which ones are going to give the best information to plan instruction and intervention. And so our recommendations for which assessments to give for fall screening aren't any different this year than they were last year or they're going to be next year, because they reflect that research. However, the major variables that must be taken into account are what have you used in the past, so that you can think about continuity of data, and what are the logistical needs or challenges in capturing the data that you need. And so if for some reason it's not possible to use our recommended assessments, either the computer-based or teacher-based ones, certainly there are other alternatives that could be utilized in relation to your school's specific needs and the students' access to technology or other variables. But in general, we don't see a need to change the assessments in terms of just this unique circumstance of COVID.
I wonder if part of this question too is wondering about going testing back in a previous grade level. So for instance, if I have a group of students that's going to 5th grade, but we know that they missed a quarter of 4th grade, what does that mean? And so in that case, we would recommend continuing exactly the way Rachel said. So give the recommended assessments on grade level for students. But if there are specific students that you have questions about skill gaps, who maybe are flagged as having as being at risk of not being proficient in reading or math, and you'd like more specific information, one of the benefits of FastBridge is that you have access to all of the assessments, right, at different grade levels. And so you could absolutely test a group of students in other skills using FastBridge after you've universally screened at grade level to identify maybe more specifically some skill gaps that you hypothesize might be there.
Great, we're almost at time. I'm going to ask 2 more quick questions. John, will the benchmarks be adjusted, or can we assume that we will have more students fall into the high risk and some risk categories? Is there a quick way for you to summarize that? And if not?
Yeah, quickly, the national normed-based benchmarks will not be adjusted. And yes, you could probably assume, depending on how effective your distance learning was, at least how you perceived it to be effective, you can probably assume there will be performance declines from previous years. More kids at high risk.
Very last question for anyone in this group.
Hence the need to focus on universal tier in the fall. Sorry, Libby.
No, it's good. Just the last question, if you came in around the screening windows, I don't know who's best to field this one, but should educators be preparing to do more screening windows, extend the screening window period, or start earlier? I don't know if there is a succinct answer for that either.
I'll take that. This is Rachel. We've gotten that one from others as well. We don't necessarily recommend that you add additional screening periods. And this is simply because we want to allocate time for instruction, not more assessments. However, the timing of your screenings might be adjusted in relation to when you, in fact, do initiate the school year, because we know dates are in flux. So that you're capturing the data in a timely manner so that it can be used to inform the best, most relevant instruction that students need when they get back to school in the fall.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for presenting today. There's a lot of really good information. I apologize for the questions that we did not get to. However, we do have a variety of additional resources that I do believe will help answer many of these unanswered questions today. One is, if you haven't yet visited our COVID community page, please know that it is there for you and available. We will have that in our, thank you, Sarah, for moving ahead. You can see the web address in the bottom there. We will include it in our recap email that you will get at the end of the week with the recording of this webinar. If you go to the next slide, Sarah, some of the questions specifically related to remote screening and progress monitoring, as well as some questions that we helped answer in part 1 of this series. All of these webinars are free and available for you to access on demand, so at your earliest convenience. And then lastly, I just wanted to make everyone aware of a webinar, thank you, Sarah, on June 2nd that is being presented by Dr. Greg Fabiano. He's one of the SEB, Social, Emotional, and Behavioral authors of the FastBridge measures. This is being sponsored through EdWeb, and he will speak specifically to Tier 1 supports that we should consider putting in place as it relates to SEB come this fall. So please join us for that as well. We'll include a link to this in our recap email, which again, you'll receive by the end of the week. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, John, Sarah, and Rachel, and we hope to see you all again soon.